So nice to have everybody here for this event tonight. My name is Mark Dixon, and I'll be your MC for this evening. I have a few opening remarks, and then we'll just jump right into the program. The sponsor of tonight's event is the Association of Pittsburgh Priests, and the topic for tonight is caring for our common home, inspiration and lessons from green congregations. Our speaker tonight, we're so glad to have Dr. Shattuck, Associate Professor at Western Michigan University in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the Department of Comparative Religion. And the date for tonight's session is Thursday, April 21st, 2022.
And may I just say what a pleasure it is to be here tonight. It was a bit of a surprise when John Osterley reached out to me because I'm still wondering how he found out about my book. Since not that many people have read it yet. and I would also like to thank all of the team that has put this evening together. I don't think I've ever worked with a more organized group of people. So thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen so you can see pictures of the interesting places that I have had the good fortune to visit in the course of doing my research. As Wanda mentioned, my real interest is in not just looking at the traditional textual sources that talk about why people of faith should care for the environment, but in talking to the people who are doing the work to find out how they have actually put faith into action. There are so many groups in the United States that have spoken up and said, as people of faith, our community members should be caring for our planet. I know you're all familiar with Pope Francis's work, but even before he stepped in, as you know, if you read the introduction to the book, he stresses that he is building on Catholic traditions set forward by Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul and popes even further back, and the work of the Vatican Science Council. So this is not a new call, it's just made more prominent by his work. And there are other organizations like Creation Justice Ministries, which is a program put out by the National Council of Churches here in the United States. Interfaith Power and Light, which began back in 2000 and now has affiliates in at least 42 states, and has been calling on people to respond to, well, you know how long it's been. They still use the words global warming, right? And few people are aware there's actually an evangelical environmental network. They put together the What Would Jesus Drive campaign when SUVs were becoming so popular, trying to encourage people to drive more fuel efficient cars. So there've been all of these efforts. In my research, I wanted to find out, when do people of faith actually take action, and what is it that helps them do that? What are the hindrances? What are the challenges? How do they overcome them? How do they create durable activities to care for the earth? And I decided to focus at the congregation level, since a congregation is a powerful group of people working together. I traveled to 15 different communities around the United States. You will notice they're somewhat concentrated around the Great Lakes because I was coming from Ann Arbor. Also, St. Thomas Aquinas Parish out in California. I was very interested in this area because the bishop in the San Jose diocese had actually started a Catholic greening initiative and was encouraging all of the parishes in the Santa Clara Valley to consider green actions. So I wanted to know what happened when you have a top-down effort and compare that with more organic efforts that were percolating up from the congregation members in other places. You'll notice that some of these are monastic communities, 4 communities of women religious, and then St. John's Abbey, which is a men's Benedictine monastery. I was fortunate to have funding to study faith-based forestry in these places that had larger land holdings, but all of the others were urban and suburban congregations, more like the majority of communities that will be doing this work in the country. So I'd like to share some of the stories and some of the things that I learned in visiting these communities. One thing that became apparent is there's no one way to do this work. There are patterns that are shared, but every one of them is its own story. When I did look at the patterns, they were more in terms of general areas of activity. So one of the things that became very apparent is that there's always a group of champions, the people who actually make the activities happen. And how successful they are, the scope of the work, the types of activities, those are then determined by the faith community within which they are doing that work. And that faith community is going to mean, the faith leaders, the leadership teams, the pastoral teams. What kind of support did they offer? And that's going to affect what happens. The congregation, how involved are they? That's going to affect the capacity for action. That's going to affect your volunteer grouping. What's your human resource baseline? It's going to affect your finances, your material abilities. And then also it's going to determine how widely you can disseminate these projects into the congregation, because that core team of champions can't do it all alone. And if they've got people in the administration, in the religious education program, in the grounds management, in the facilities management who are helping them, things go a lot farther. And then the organizational structure, the ministry programs, whether there is an education program, all of those factors, how decisions are made in the community, those are going to affect what happens. So I'll tell you some stories and give examples of the things that people were doing. One of the first places I visited was Trinity Presbyterian Church down in Virginia. And this church is actually in an old house. And they began an Earth Care House Church all the way back in 1996. A number of the members in the church on a retreat discovered that they had a shared concern for the environment. Now, a house church is a small group within the larger church community that feels called to address a particular topic. And so if somebody has an idea for a house church, they speak to other members of the congregation, and if there's a shared interest, then they bring a proposal before the entire congregation to get permission to start a house church. In this case, they wanted to start an Earth Care House Church with a mission to promote church and community awareness and involvement in restoring creation. And once the congregation approved this, then they had to fulfill these 4 different areas every year. They had to engage in nurture, which was to do study about how their faith traditions and its teachings connect to the topic that they're focusing on. They also had to come up with activities to fulfill their mission every day or every year. And then 2 characteristics of the house church that are somewhat unique. They engage in weekly worship together as a small group. And they also are, there's a tradition of fellowship where they share each other's joys and concerns. So there's a long tradition, for example, of celebrating birthdays and graduations of children and grandchildren, and also being there for each other in the hard times. So with this framework, they set out to study, as Presbyterians, what did their tradition tell them about caring for the earth? And the Presbyterian Church actually has a number of publications that talk about social justice and the need to care for those who are most affected by pollution, most affected by the inequitable sharing of our natural resources, and also the damage to the earth, God's creation, and how that should be restored. So they did this study. And the people I interviewed said, the study was great, but then once we'd really done the study, we wanted to actually act on it. By the way, they also told me that if you're in the South, like in Virginia, it's really important to get your theology straight first, because someone's going to challenge you and say, environment's not a Christian thing. And you need to be able to cite chapter and verse to say, oh, yes, it is. And this is why we're doing this work. So one of the first projects they really got involved with had to do with the recognition of acid rain air pollution in Shenandoah National Park. They would organize outings for the church youth to the park, and they became aware of the air pollution. And as they became aware of how the pollution was damaging the natural environment, they also became much more aware of how it was damaging human health too. But when they started researching the causes of the air pollution, they discovered it wasn't even local. The issue was that over in West Virginia, they were using coal to generate energy. And because the prevailing winds in the United States are from west to east, the air pollution from those coal burning power plants was flowing into Virginia. They also learned that the coal that was being used in those power plants was produced through mountaintop removal mining. And many of you are probably familiar with this problem, where the coal seams in the Appalachian Mountains are about 500 feet below the peaks of the mountains. And the mining companies have figured out that the cheapest way to get to it is to just take the top off the mountain and dump it in a valley. So you see in the left-hand picture, that used to be a valley between those trees, and now it's completely filled in with the rubble from the mountaintop that's been dumped there. This is not good for the streams. It contaminates the streams, it contaminates the fish and wildlife, it threatens the communities that are downstream with water pollution, flood hazards, decimation of their traditional lifestyles. So here was the problem. Their beloved Shenandoah National Valley was being polluted by air pollution from power plants in a different state, burning coal that was being produced in a way that was destroying the natural environment. And they're realizing the only way to deal with this is to take on national energy policy. And they're thinking, you know, we're just this little group of 12 people. What can a little house church do about national energy policy? But they decided that God does not call us to do little things. And furthermore, their pastor had this saying she was very fond of: God calls you to be faithful, not successful. So even if you don't know if you can win this battle, you still get to try. And the trying itself is important. The trying itself is a valuable expression of your faith. She also reminded them they weren't just a little house church. They were the members of a church community that extended throughout the entire United States. And so what they did was to put together a resolution and take it to the General Assembly meeting of the Presbyterian Church USA, where there would be representatives from all of the denominational churches in the United States. And in that resolution, they said that they were calling on the Presbyterian Church USA denomination to send information to all of its member churches throughout the United States to educate people about the environmental and health consequences of coal plant pollution. And they were going to ask people to urge their government officials to enforce our existing clean air laws, to end the grandfather exemptions that allow polluting plants that have been in place before we got good laws to continue polluting as if those laws didn't apply to them. And also that maybe we actually need a better clean air laws. And they would also ask that the advocacy office of the Presbyterian USA in Washington, D.C. Take this up at the national level. I have to say, I was surprised to discover even the Mennonites have an advocacy office in Washington, D.C. I did not realize almost every denomination has one. So they made this presentation at the General Assembly meeting in 2002, and it passed unanimously. And it got so much press that representatives of the Southern Company, one of the major utilities in the South that is responsible for a great deal of the pollution in the United States, actually asked to meet with them. And Lynn Cameron, whom I interviewed, she's a librarian. And so she put together a whole packet of information with peer-reviewed studies about the damage from coal pollution, and went to meet with these representatives of the Southern Company who tried to convince her that they were really good folks, and they could prove that because they supported the Boy Scouts. And she said, you know, it's just so powerful to look people in the eye and speak truth to power. And she felt that even though there wasn't any immediate change in policies of Southern Company, that had to eventually make a difference because it had to affect the hearts of the people that they were meeting with. The other thing that came out of this was this Earth Care House Church. I mean, there was like, we just got the entire Presbyterian Church to back us on this project. There is no stopping us now, right? So going back home, they started thinking, okay, we know what we're against. We're against the damage to the environment, but what are we for? So much environmental work starts with what you're against, but then thinking, what are you for? What are you striving to make the world look like? How are you going to walk the talk? So they started thinking about what they could do in their own church building, in their own lives. And one of the things they thought was particularly important was to work with the youth. Here you see children on an outing, they're looking for crawdads. They got a grant to create a summer program so that urban youth could go to natural areas and learn about the environment. They started using, they have a wall of mugs, so they use washable dishes instead of using disposables. It became a sort of fellowship opportunity to wash dishes together in the kitchen. But one of the really neat programs they had was that they took the tweens, the middle schoolers, and they showed them how to do weatherization, how to do window caulking and apply weather stripping. And then they essentially turned them loose on the old building part of their church. And the kids were going from room to room, figuring out problem solving. Okay, what tool do we use on this window? What tool do we use on this door? Which is going to be most effective here? And they told me about how 3 little 11-year-old girls, one with the damp sponge washing down the window edges, one with the caulk gun coming behind, running the bead of caulk, and the third one with her damp finger and her little cup of water, smoothing out the caulk. And so the kids were empowered to actually do this work in the church. And then they asked them, what are you going to do now that you finished the church? And the kids like, oh, we're going home and we're doing this at our houses now, right? So there was this ripple effect out from the church of these programs. Now, one of the things that became apparent as I was speaking to this group, they'd been doing this work for almost 20 years. And they told me a big part of what made it possible were those traditions of communal fellowship and communal worship. The fellowship was so important to keeping their spirits up. So if somebody was really feeling depressed about what was going with the environment, there were other people there to listen and share those concerns. But also the worship. Whenever I would find people who had been active in environmental groups, as well as doing this in a faith community, I would ask, how is it different? So with Lynn Cameron, I asked her, since she was a longtime Sierra Club member, how is it different to do this in your faith community? And she said, the Sierra Club is great. We get outdoors, we connect with nature, it's wonderful. But it's different when you're going outdoors and you're celebrating nature as God's creation. And you're recognizing that you're not doing this work on your own. There is a greater support for this work than comes just from you as a human being. So she said that was really a big part of what made it possible for them to keep going for so many years. So we see in this particular church that Care for the Earth really became an expression of the church's mission. And this house church every year would report on their work. All the house churches come back and they give a report to the congregation and they say, here are the things that we've accomplished this year. Will you recall us to do this work again for another year? And the congregation then says, yes, we think this is an expression of our church's mission, which is striving to be the church in the world through servant ministries. And having that backing meant that if an issue came up, like there was a project to do some fracking or something that would damage the environment locally, the Earth Care House Church could go and they could testify in public and they could say, we represent our church, and they didn't have to get permission every single time, which can be a slow process. They knew that they had the backing of their faith community. So they were deeply motivated to do this work, and they had the faith foundation to do it, but they also had support that helped them implement this. The affirmation and advice of their pastor, who helped them figure out how to address some of the challenges that they faced, and also emphasized that the work that they were doing truly mattered. And then they were sustained by these traditions of faith and fellowship. In all 15 congregations that I visited, I asked people about their motivations, and often the first thing they talked about wasn't actually religion. It was often their children and their grandchildren, or their nieces and nephews, or young people whom they loved. So people would talk about special people they wanted to protect, especially the young people, or they would talk about special places. And so I came to see that so often when we talk about climate change particularly, this is something that seems big and overwhelming, And we have this sense of paralysis. But when it comes to fighting for the people and the places we love, we figure out how to do it. So it's really love that motivates people to move from stasis to action. And I also did meet many people who said, they'd really never thought about the environment as an issue until it was presented to them as a faith issue, that it was something that connected to their religious values. And if they didn't respond to the environmental issues out there, then they couldn't accomplish the other missions of their faith community, such as poverty alleviation or reducing violence in the world and achieving world peace. That all of those things were exacerbated by climate change, so that they needed to be thinking about that in order to fulfill these other ministry areas. So that led me to really recognize that a very important part of these movements that I was studying was the leadership that came from the leadership teams or the spiritual leaders within the community who were talking about why this was a faith issue that the entire community should work on. As the Reverend Jeff Wild said, we know we need to care for the environment, but we have to ask, why should we as people of faith have concern for the environment? And the point he was making wasn't that there would be less environmental action if it was not faith-based, but basically he was saying, you can join the Sierra Club. There are places to do this. If we're going to do it here, in our church, in our synagogue, in our place of worship, it has to be because it's part of our faith tradition. It really connects to our spiritual tradition. So here you see the Madison Christian Community Church, where he's retired now, but he was the pastor when I was interviewing them. And of course, the US Catholic bishops put out a statement all the way back in 1998, saying that this was true in the Catholic tradition. And when I was interviewing people, the theological foundations that people were talking about were consistent with other research that's been done. There's a very strong stewardship ethic where people talk about commandments, all of the passages, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, that talk about how people should behave in an ethical way towards animals, towards the soil, care of the land. To love your neighbor, you should not pollute your neighbor's air, as the Reverend Sally Bingham says. The strong social justice ethic, which is so beautifully developed by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. People who talk about the earth and nature as a place where we have spiritual experiences and how our spiritual lives would be impoverished if we did not have the opportunity to go out into nature and natural spaces and have those experiences. And I'm not going to go deeply into these because I'm sure you're familiar with these ideas. But one of the things that I found that really stood out, and it's not been talked about in scholarship on faith-based theology, is that when enacting an earth care program in a faith community, it's important not just to say as Christians we should do this or as Jews we should do this, but to talk about why we should do this because it connects to who we are in this particular faith community. How does it connect to the Madison Christian community, to Trinity Presbyterian Church, to St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in California? There was the very specific connection that people were making. A couple of examples. In Evanston, Illinois, the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation their building was the first platinum LEED certified synagogue in the United States. And Rabbi Rosen commented that building the building in a green way fit with all of the other work that JRC did to effect Tikkun Olam, the healing of the world, which is the social justice mission of Judaism. And he specifically, in this quote, he links it to working in a food kitchen, marching in a rally for immigrant rights. Those are not random examples. Those are things his congregation does, right? So he's connecting it to other activities that are already being done in the community to say, yes, these are things we do to fulfill our call to do Tikkun Olam, and the green building is part of that too. And so in this case, when they were trying to decide what to do about an old building that they'd outgrown, should they sell it and move somewhere else? Should they tear it down and build a new one? Should they try to renovate it? The environmental team in the synagogue came to him and said, what if we did green building? And he got so involved in that idea he got to starting every board meeting with environmental passages out of the Torah. So he was really emphasizing the faith connection there and how this was a fulfillment of their values. And so I just wanted to show you some of the features of this building. The concrete, it has recycled fly ash, which is a waste product from energy production that is a contaminant and needs to be corralled. They put the sanctuary on the top floor so that even though they're in an urban environment, they're looking out at the trees, so they have the illusion of green space. The wood that they have used is from ash trees that were killed by the emerald ash borer. So rather than cut down living trees, they are using the wood of trees that were already dead. And those trees then, instead of going into a landfill, are being used in this beautiful way to create this roof line that is meant to evoke the tabernacle, the tent that the Israelites used while traveling through the desert. And also above the cabinet where the Torah scroll is held, you have the eternal flame, which is solar powered. And that's not a big difference in energy use, but the symbolism is powerful for reminding people about the connection to the environment every week. They also, they did an analysis of how they used energy, and they decided that solar panels didn't really make sense on their building because solar panels are great if you're using sort of stable amounts of energy all week. But in this case, what you have is a big spike in energy use on the Sabbath, and then not that much needed during the weeks. So they decided it made much more sense with their energy patterns to invest in highly energy efficient appliances and motion sensors on lights and things like that, instead of putting it into solar panels. So really thinking about how the space is used and what choices can be made that are most relevant or most effective in those conditions. I know you're near Villa Maria and the holdings of the Sisters of the Humility of Mary. This also was a site I visited. And there too, there was, when Sister Barbara was developing the the environmental ministries there and the eco-spirituality programs, and then the garden that has grown into such an amazing project there. There was this grounding in the mission, the charism of the sisters, but also in their history, their sense of identity as a community that had cared for this land for over 100 years. So she talked about the link between the humus, the soil, and the humility in their name. And she drew on the historical records about Father Bajel and the sisters as subsistence farmers who cared for this land when they first arrived there. And that historical connection then became a very strong part of the understanding about why they should actually engage in earth care going forward. So we see this rooting in community identity. At the Madison Christian community, it became such a strong emphasis that it's now their mission statement: to live faithfully and lovingly with God, neighbors, and creation. And the solar panels that provide about a third of their energy, these are important to them, not only for the energy, but also because this is the side of the building that faces the road. So anybody driving past sees these solar panels, and it's a visible witness to the values of this community and their mission to care for the earth. Another project at the Madison Christian community is a children's garden. And this speaks to another pattern I was seeing in communities I visited, which was the importance of partnerships with other organizations. So that the congregation doesn't have to do it all themselves. They are often more effective if they can connect with other community groups, sometimes a partnership between a couple of different congregations. Maybe one has a food pantry and everybody grows food and sends it to the one that already has a food pantry. So there's a pre-established distribution system. Or in this case, the partnership was between the church and a neighborhood center about a mile away in a much lower income neighborhood. And these children during the summer come over for a Kids in the Garden program where they learn about caring for plants. And in the process, they are learning responsibility, they're developing a sense of efficacy, There was a little girl named Ruthie. She was about 10 years old. And she said to somebody, or to one of the adults running the program, she says, you can't lie to the earth. I might tell you I watered, but the flowers will tell you whether I did or not. So there was this sense that the children were learning important social values through this program. And they are also, as part of this program, learning to prepare healthy snacks. So there's one group of kids out in the garden learning to care for the garden. And then there's another group in the kitchen taking produce from the garden and learning to make healthy snacks with it. And then all of these kids get to take a bag of food home with them every week. So they're contributing to their family's food during the summers when they don't have access to school lunch programs. But this isn't charity, because these kids grew that food themselves, right? So they have a sense of ownership and sweat equity. And apparently they even learned to like broccoli. Now, the gardens at the Madison Christian community have actually been connected to other ministries in the church. The gardens are quite extensive. They actually have a 6-acre campus. 3 of those acres are in restored prairie, but the gardens it's over an acre. And so what they do every spring is they buy their seedlings from a horticultural program run in one of the prisons, where the prisoners are learning skills so that hopefully when they come back into society, they will be able to get jobs. And also a prison furlough work team comes to the church and helps to set up the garden every year. And then they have lunch with members of the church who express their appreciation. And this is part of a restorative justice program to try to help these prisoners recognize that they can be valued in society, and that when they are released from prison, they have options to do good in the community and lead healthier lives once they get out. The gardens have also become a means of community engagement. So any family with kids who comes through the garden to check out the chickens is invited to sign up for the chicken care team. You don't have to join the church to be part of that. It's become an outreach mechanism for engaging with the neighbors. And then, of course, working with the children, teaching them garden skills and sending them food is a poverty alleviation program. And they also have some plots that community members can use to grow food for themselves. So this was a pattern that I saw across these congregations, the importance of connecting to existing programs so you don't have to start from scratch and do all the work yourself. At the St. Thomas Aquinas Parish, one of the things they did was to do a lot of their environmental education during the annual picnic. So they would put together games like the taste test of tap water versus bottled water. Could you tell the difference, to convince people they should stop wasting their money on bottled water? They would have recycling games to teach people how to recycle materials accurately, working through the education programs in the schools. One of the things that happened out here in the San Jose diocese is that a number of the parishes got together to see if they could get a discount on solar panels if they did a bulk buy. And of course, the solar installers looked at all of these parish churches, tall buildings, steep roofs, and they said, that's a terrible place for solar panels. But your church has a school, and that's a great roof for solar panels. So they actually ended up putting the solar panels on the Catholic school. So things you learn when you're not thinking big enough, and then you start working together and these opportunities emerge. So seeing these partnerships that emerged, both within the congregations and then between the congregations and either other faith communities or secular organizations. I also saw the importance of involving the congregation so that the larger congregation had some buy-in and didn't think of this as just the activity of the little green group, not just something for the environmentalists, something that belongs to everybody. So one of the neatest ideas I saw was that in the Madison Christian Community Garden, they had these amazing scarecrows, and they would ask people to donate clothing. And I really hope that the thing with the poppies is actually a bed sheet and not actual clothing, because I don't, envisioning somebody wearing this is a little odd. But people could donate even if they weren't they didn't have the time, or they didn't have the physical capability to help work in the garden. And then the kids, this was their favorite scarecrow, because it had the basket, and this sort of goblin-y head down here was sitting in the basket. So the kids, being naturally macabre as small children are, every time they came to the garden, they'd have to go and look into the basket and see the little goblin head that was sitting in the basket there. But this was a way to involve more people. People who couldn't work in the garden could still have produce. They set up a whiteboard with a list of tasks. So you didn't have to be on the garden committee to help out, but if you just had like an extra 15 minutes and you wanted to just do something to help, you could go look at the list, see there was something that you could do, like watering one of the small beds, and then check it off on the list and go home again. So there was these creative efforts to get people involved. Another involvement story I loved, back at the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation, when they were going to build the new building, the soil under it was very sandy. So they were going to have to sink these concrete caissons to provide support for it. And there were going to be 18 of them. Now, 18 is a sacred number in Judaism. It's the same, the number adds, it equals the letters in the word Chaim, for life. And so they did a project with the kids in 3rd and 5th grade and asked them, what are the pillars of religious life here in our congregation? And the kids brainstormed, and they came up with this list with things like joy and prayer and song, tikkun olam, friendship, learning. And so they put one of these words on a slip of paper and made 18 slips of paper. And then the contractors put one in each of those concrete caissons. So the children were involved in the building of the building. Another favorite story of all these sorts of connections, the Madison Christian community, they had a bur oak tree that had become diseased and needed to be removed. And instead of just waiting for some summer when fewer people were around, they made oak trees, trees, the theme of the year. And they had people worked with a storyteller to tell stories about trees that were important in their lives. They looked at Bible passages that mentioned trees. But they also had this project where the kids went out and gathered the acorns, and then they ground and leached the acorns and turned them into flour and sent them home with people, and they baked them into the communion bread. And they brought them in, and then they actually had communion with bread that included the acorn flour, so that they could really connect with the tree. So this bringing together all of the different elements and weaving environment into education and worship. One of the interesting things that the ministers at the Madison Christian community talked about was how, by focusing on earth care on the grounds of the church and in the building of the church, people were developing a stronger sense of attachment to place, a connection to the church building and grounds. Reverend Wild called it ministry of place. He also said it made them better Trinitarians, because he said, I'm a Lutheran and we talk a lot about Jesus and resurrection and what comes afterwards. But here we were focusing on God the Creator and the presence of the Holy Spirit in the world around us. And he said it really improved the theology of his sermons to be thinking about this. Another issue that I saw come up in congregations is that people tried things until they found the right projects. Sometimes they were things that were emerging issues, like heavier rainfall because of climate change and the way it's affecting the rainfall patterns in the United States. And so putting together a rooftop stormwater collection system and then using that water to water the garden was a project. Putting in rain gardens to capture the stormwater before it went off into the street. And that's also, it can be helpful for filtering out pollutants. And rain gardens then can also become an opportunity to prevent flooding in basements by moving the water further away from the building. And also you can add pollinator habitat or wildlife habitat so that you're not just caring for the humans and their buildings, you're also caring for the butterflies and the beetles and the birds and the bats and all of the other wonderful creatures that help to make this world function properly and maintain its ecosystem health. Another example of a project, the people needing to find the right project. The First Universalist Church in Rockland, Maine, helped to sponsor the first community-supported agriculture farm in Maine. It was this young couple. They wanted to start a farm. They needed subscribers. And so they came to the church and 14 people said, okay. So they started with 14 the first year. Then they had 41 the second year. Then they had 120. And then they had to cap it at 200 because that was as many as they could feed. And the church was the drop-off site, or people could go out to the farm. And it was such a success that within 5 years, this young couple was able to purchase the land that they were leasing. So for many people, this was one of these projects that got the congregation involved, and they said, okay, we want to have this green activities. What are your interests? And people said, well, we're really concerned about food. We're worried about how far it travels. We're worried about pesticides and chemicals. We want it to be organic. And so this really was the perfect project that emerged to connect with the interests of the congregation. But one of the gentlemen that I interviewed, Frank Mundo, who's there in the red plaid shirt, he told me, okay, food, it's nice, it's great. But the big issue is climate change. The world, or as he said, the environment is going down the toilet. And he was so despairing about the state of the world. They had a green chalice circle where they would get together to read environmental texts. And he would go, but he stopped doing the reading because he was just so depressed about the state of the environment and just overwhelmed by despair. What changed for him was that they did an energy audit of the church, and they realized that they were losing a lot of energy, a lot of heat through the basement windows. So he and his friend Dick learned how to make storm window inserts that they could put on the interior of the windows. And within 1 month, they could see a dramatic change in the energy bill for the church. So then other people got really excited, and they said, hey, could you make those for our houses? So these guys who had these amazing table saws where you could put the measurements into your laptop and it would communicate with the table saw and make things just the right size, which I now really want one of those. So they started making these storm window inserts for people in the church. And then that turned into this really big project where they got this idea that they could actually partner with other congregations, go to people's homes, measure a bunch of windows, create essentially kits that would just need to be assembled, and then kind of like a barn raising, have an assembly day where a whole bunch of volunteers would get together in a large room at a local church, assemble these, and then deliver them to people. And it was really important to work with other faith communities because you can't just knock on someone's door and say, hey, can I come in and measure your windows, right? You need people who've got trust, who can reach out to their members, the community, and say, hey, there's this great opportunity, come be a part of it. They said it was particularly important to work with the Catholic parishes in their area because they were from a very middle-class church and they wanted to make some of these storm windows available for free to low-income communities. And the Catholic parish could help them with that outreach and that trust. So this project grew. It got to the point where they were doing about 3,000 windows a year. And then they arranged to subcontract some of the kit making to the local prison so that the prisoners in their woodshop would be making the kits, but they still do the community build because the community aspect of it is so important. And for Frank, this project was when he started to feel hopeful again. He had a sense of efficacy that he was doing something. The Storm Window Project, there were economic benefits. People were saving on energy so they could better afford to live in their homes. Younger families and older families with fixed incomes, it helped them economically. But the biggest benefit is he said, I know that I'm having an effect on climate change because if people don't need as much energy to heat their homes, there are fewer greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. There was also the benefit of the community building, the relationships, the moral support. And he said, the best thing is I can see the difference. You can see the power decline, use decline. You can see the energy bill decline. I'm not waiting for some politician to do something. So I'd like to emphasize that there are many, many, many ways to enact an earth care ethic in a faith community, whether that's through advocacy, through resource conservation. If you happen to have the resources and the right kind of space for renewable energy generation, through building community resilience. I think we don't always think about community gardens and education and ecosystem restorations in terms of building the community connections, but I think those community connections are just as important as the physical changes, because as we've seen through the last few years of the pandemic, our social networks and our relationships are really important to our capacity to weather stresses and to get through difficult times. And so through all of these types of activities, I see congregations engaging in earth care, which gives a sense of efficacy to the communities. All the congregations I studied, not the monastic communities, but all the regular urban and suburban congregations had stable memberships and tended to have a lot of younger families. And that is not normal right now in the United States. So this kind of work was making a difference. People wanted to be part of these communities. And I really am hopeful that this kind of work is changing the general perception of climate care so that more and more people see it as something we all should do. Coming back to my original model of the groups, so one of the things that I found was these overlaps where the legitimacy presented by the faith community was really important for the congregation, seeing that sense of identity connection, how it fit with the community identity, how it connected to their mission. The involvement of the congregation really depended on the structures, who makes the decisions, how do you get the community involved. The faith leaders, their support really strengthened the commitment of the individuals or the champions who are leading these projects. And then also if the projects could be connected to programs and ministries and activities that already existed, there was a much greater efficacy. It was much easier to get things started and keep them going. And there would be a greater proliferation of projects because the person who works in the office starts helping with energy conservation or printing double-sided or recycling the paper or turning the computer off at night or all those things. The green team doesn't have to go and do it, right? So you see everybody helping out throughout the organization. So that's what I have to share with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shattuck. That was such a wonderful presentation. I appreciated it so much. Yeah, everybody, please give Dr. Shattuck a round of applause. You can put an icon on your Zoom box or whatever you like. It's lovely to see all the faces there in the audience. Please, everybody, consider your questions and feel free to drop those in the chat. We have a couple more now. We're going to pivot to a local set of examples of some local green faith-based projects. And so we'll move right into that. But then after that, we'll have a whole discussion and Q&A forum, open forum that you can all participate in. So please consider your questions for that open forum time while we hear from these two additional speakers. Up first, we have Lynn Simkowitz, CSJ, Director of Grounds and Eco Projects at Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden in Pennsylvania, just northwest of Pittsburgh.
Great, thank you, Mark.
Yeah,
and thank you, Sibel. Actually, I'm no longer director of eco projects. I'm on the leadership team, but still involved in the work that we do. But Sibel, I have to agree, everything that you shared is right on target. Just the interconnection of all of that stuff. For the Sisters of St. Joseph, you know, we have a rather long history of just having a farm atmosphere in terms of when we were founded in 1869 and continuing that in 1901 here in Baden. So we had a working farm through the 1960s. But, you know, the other reality is that, you know, everything comes around. And so we find ourselves now, in 2007, we actually created as a congregation an ecological ethic of place in which we grounded everything that we do related to earth in a sacramental realm, so that it was about we see earth as a sacrament, which has the capacity to relate God in all that we do. And so whether it's in the mother house or whether it's where we are in mission, that's kind of the focus. How do we relate to Earth in that manner? And so, we've done so many things. I could probably take the same 40 minutes to explain that. But on the Mother House grounds itself, we do have 2 community gardens. We have our own garden that actually we provide fresh produce to the Mother House kitchen. But our community gardens actually provide produce to 2 food banks and 2 soup kitchens. But they also we have some chickens, and they provide some protein, which is usually the hardest thing to produce for soup kitchens or food banks. So actually we provide those, and actually the chickens are the biggest hit on the property anytime people visit. But it's the fact that it also creates an environment to actually engage people in conversation about care for the Earth. We also use our site as field trip destinations for some of the low-income areas around us, because children that grow up in an urban environment have no sense of nature or creation or bugs or Earth. And so, we provide a number of those opportunities for young people to just experience that. Along in our community gardens, we also have what we call a Green Teens program, which actually helps train some of those folks, some of the younger teens who need some work experience. We train them in sustainable gardening so that they can actually learn work skills so that they can maybe be hired in landscape or gardening, work sites. But we have found those to be so wonderful, because when those kids who are usually on the edge of either not making it in other arenas because they're kind of rough around the edges, we find that the Earth actually gentles them and working with it just changes their personality. So we've just been so blessed with that. But there's the practical pieces, but there's also the systemic that we do. Other than the ecological ethic of place, we also opted into the Green Workplace Challenge, which is offered by Sustainable Pittsburgh, and it's an opportunity for anyone in that the Pittsburgh or the Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio region to actually really work at creating a sustainable workplace. And so we've been involved in that since 2012, just really trying to create a baseline for our utilities, for our diversity, equity, and inclusion pieces. And just in 2019, we actually created a sustainability committee within the Mother House that is also applicable, within the congregation in general. So it's a way of trying to actually get the baseline going, not only in the Mother House complex, but also in our local houses. And we put out monthly publications, that hopefully educate some of the folks in the neighborhoods where our sisters are located. They're free to pass those along or email them, just so that we can kind of continue educating and offer some practical pieces that people can do. Just in 2021, we signed on to the Laudato Si action platform, which is an international, it's kind of a groundswell. It's working from the ground up. We committed to 7 years of really trying to implement a lot of the actions of Laudato Si, not only in our congregation, in our neighborhoods, and all of the groups that we can influence as an organization through their 7 goals. So I think that there is so much we can do as local organizations, and it's just the simple things. I think one of the major points for me, not only in terms of the environmental piece or sustainability piece being a sacramental action that is so rooted in our faith, it's one that just how could you as a Christian not lean towards life? And for me, I think it's that simple. So I would just want to say I would just suggest if anyone wants to be a part of some of the monthly updates that we do, just go to our website as stjoseph-baden.org, and you can access any of those sustainability updates. So thank you so much. And Sibel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's just so wonderful to hear what you're working on, and I've enjoyed working with your community there, and it's just an absolute delight to see these projects flourish locally. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Tony Kurzman, Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Materials Science at the University of Pittsburgh Swanson School of Engineering, and he'll be speaking with us about the Care for Creation team at St. John's Parish. Tony.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. And I love how Lynn said, how could we not choose life? I think one of the things I always say in my classes, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a quick little side note here. One of the things I always say in my classes, every single thing that we do and every choice we make has an impact on the environment and the world around us. And so things that we do, like driving a car powered by gas or choosing to burn fossil fuels for our electricity, has some really severe effects. And so I recently came across a study by Harvard Institute, and approximately 8 million people die each year just from the emissions from fossil fuels. So quite literally, when you flip the switch and you don't use solar or wind, you're contributing to that. So I think that is a real practical message to tell people. And so I agree with Lynn, choose life, please. Anyway, so I'm one of the leaders for the Creation Care Group for St. John Newman. We started back in October, so we're only about 6 months old here. For those of you that might not know, St. John Newman's just outside of Pittsburgh, about 20-minute north of Pittsburgh, driving in Franklin Park. It's a pretty active community. There's a lot of ministries there, so let's say a lot of competition for for us to try to recruit people. We have an awesome group, about 8 to 10 people that come regularly to our meetings. We have monthly meetings, and so we established our Creation Care Group in the fall, like I said, and we first started off with St. John Newman had an evangelization team, and there were a number of parishioners there that were very supportive of the organization. And so my background is mechanical engineering, but it's focused on renewable energy and sustainability. So I said, well, that kind of fits in some of the things I've done in the past, and I'd be happy to try and lead that group. So I try my best to try and keep things organized and that kind of thing. One of the tasks was for us to seek approval for the group, right? That was kind of one of the initial establishment tasks. We also wanted to make sure that we incorporated the themes, readings, and discussions from Laudato Si in each of our meetings. So we try to do that and keep those themes, Laudato Si, sort of flowing in our discussion. We also found that there's a lot of great resources for those that might be interested in establishing a Creation Care Group. A lot of really great resources on the Catholic Climate Covenant website and the Laudato Si Action Platform. So we found some really great stuff there. Before I hop into some of our successes, I just wanted to talk about a couple small challenges that we've come across. The first one, we needed to make sure that we had buy-in from the parish pastor, right? And so we approached the pastor, and luckily he was very supportive of the group. Still supports many of the crazy questions we ask him. He's still supportive of us today. So we've actually done, I think we've done quite a bit in the last 6 months or so. One of the other challenges was simply getting organized. There's quite a bit that goes into putting together a monthly meeting, and some of the tasks that we have, we try to divvy up the workload, let's say. And so sometimes that can lead to some tricky organizational tasks, I guess. But we've had a number of successes. So one thing we kind of started off by saying we wanted to go through Laudato Si step by step. So each monthly meeting, we'd go through a chapter, and we actually used Bill Hubish's reading guide to kind of foster discussion and things like that. One of the things we're really proud of is we've been posting in the bulletin for about 5 months now. Every week we have a little, we've got some real estate in the bulletin, a small space where we're able to, post about items that have some sort of Laudato Si or environmental theme. We usually try to tie it back to that weekly Sunday reading, if possible, and those kind of things. So the posts, I think, have been really well received. We're proud of those. We've also maybe taken a bit more of a practical spin lately. So one of the things that happened in our community very recently was for whatever reason, the community has decided to stop their glass recycling program. So they've also reduced their plastic recycling. I think we can only recycle plastics 1 and 2. But we decided that, since glass is basically infinitely recyclable, it's a real shame that would go into the landfill. So we decided to purchase a large 45-gallon recycling bin. We placed it next to the kitchen and posted signs all over Parish Hall to make sure that people knew that they could bring their glass in, and we would bring it to the recycle facility. So we have a schedule. We take turns emptying the recycle bin every week, and we've had a pretty good success with that so far. One of the other things we identified was that there were recycle bins here and there. They were pretty sporadic. So, we went ahead and purchased some small 7-gallon recycle bins and put them in almost every room. We still have a couple more to purchase, but the idea there was obviously to make recycling easier and more visible. But one of the little nuances that we came up with, I think, was made things a little bit more fun. We actually put a little trivia question on each recycle bin, and in order to answer the question, you would have to go to the next recycle bin. So I'll give you a quick example. We had a trivia question that said, how many pounds of air pollution are saved by recycling 1 ton of paper? And there was an A, B, C, D, right? 3 pounds, 10 pounds, 60 pounds, 500 pounds. And so you could choose whatever answer you thought. And the last thing we did was we did an energy audit. We kind of went through the building, looked at some of the thermostats, the weather stripping. We looked at some of the HVAC equipment, lighting, that kind of thing. And so we identified some pretty cool ways to reduce energy consumption. And so, replacing thermostats, installing energy efficient lighting, and so on. And we actually are planning, I think it's May 2nd it's due. So I gotta get on this, but the Victory Knoll Sisters have a $1,000 grant that's available. So we're going to apply for that. Thank you, Victory Knoll Sisters. And we would like to install some energy efficient lighting and occupancy sensors in the parish hall to reduce our consumption. And then the final thing that we have here is a little bit more long term, but we would like to start investigating how feasible it is to install solar on our parish hall. A quick note about solar is about 1/20th. There are still some environmental impacts with the production of solar, but once it's installed, there's pretty much nothing. But with that, it's about 1/20th the environmental impacts compared to like natural gas, let's say. And the costs of solar to install have dropped about 70% in the last 10 years. It's actually pretty rare, unless you're in certain circumstances, that solar electricity would be any more expensive than any fossil fuel generated electricity. And in fact, I have solar on my roof. I pay less than 6 cents per kilowatt hour. If I didn't have it, I would pay over about 12 cents per kilowatt hour. And so my rate's going to be 6 cents per kilowatt hour for 30 plus years. So those people that might say solar is expensive, I say it's way more expensive not to do solar. So maybe spread that message, because it's very true when you look at the life cycle of the solar. That's all I have for you, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's great to hear those tidbits and pieces of how you're piecing it all together there, and some of the challenges you've had and some of the successes you've had. Thank you so much for sharing that candidly with us here tonight.
Sibel, the examples you had were so wonderful. Just creative, diverse, just great. In finding those success stories, was it easy, or did you really have to, comb things to be able to come up with? In other words, in looking for various congregations, did you have a sense that there's a lot to choose from, or we're just getting started?
Well, I got lucky because at the time when I started doing my research, I found 3 great sources. Back then, the National Religious Partnership for the Environment actually had a web page with a map of the United States and dots all over it, and every dot led to a little story. So I went through all of those, and then I went to the websites for all those congregations to see what they had done since that story was published, and I would find a lot of those didn't have any longevity, or there was just the one project, but there were a few others where they had grown into a real mission. And so I made a list of those. And then the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology had a website where they would have lists of projects for Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus and Christians. And so I was going through their web pages and also seeing, which some of them were like big interfaith projects, but some of them were congregation specific. And then I also used the Interfaith Power and Light Cool congregations and the Green Faith certified congregations over in New Jersey and New York and that area. And so I was going through these websites and collecting information on all of these congregations that I could find online, and then checking against the web pages to see what was still going on. And then I really wanted to find those that had durable programs that had gone on for at least 4 years, because so often something goes for 1 or 2 years and then it dies out. So I wanted to know how you keep it going. And I also was really interested in the smaller subset of communities where clearly this had become a social norm for the congregation, or seemed to have become something that was sort of a mission of the congregation. And even then I found some of them that looked that way they were in green certification programs, and they got to the end and the green team was burned out and they kind of stopped, or 1 or 2 projects kept going, but the bulk of it didn't. So that was, even then, I was finding some that they lasted 4 years and that was it. And then just a few projects kept going. I think there would be a lot more now. There's now a Green the Church movement that's been going on for about 12 years in the African-American churches. And I would love to study them, but the pandemic got in my way just when I was finding some of them had been doing things long enough. I thought they would be really interesting to go and visit congregations. But one of the things that's really interesting is in 2016, when Donald Trump got elected, some of the organizations that used to promote congregation level action really shifted towards doing advocacy work instead. So we saw Green Faith kind of shift gears. Some of the others kind of shifted gears. So it's a little harder. There's not a central clearinghouse anymore. And that webpage that I used, they redid their website and that went away. So I got lucky. My timing was great for finding those, actually.
Super. Thank you, Dr. Shattuck, for that. I'm going to mention just a couple additional comments in the chat here. Paula mentioned that there's a Laudato Si action platform at laudatosiactionplatform.org/about. And also Lynn from St. Joseph Baden put in their website, www.stjoseph-baden.org. And you can search for the sustainability page there. And then there's a question that I'd like to jump to. Maureen O'Brien asks, I'm wondering if anyone has suggestions for parishes with limited financial resources, but numerous old buildings from mergers, etc. How to come to practical solutions in new realities while being environmentally conscious and getting the attention of busy pastors and parishioners. I wonder if any of our speakers, particularly Dr. Shattuck, has comments on that. But we also may have some people who want to put answers to that in the chat as well.
Yeah. if I could start with the second part, this was a common pattern, actually. Of the communities I studied, like 8 out of 10 of the suburban urban parishes, the leadership did not come from the clergy. The clergy were supportive, but the leadership came from laity, and clergy offered advice, and it was really helpful if they would lift up the work of their creation care group, Green Team, to let people know about it. And so I think one of the things that helps is if there's a clear ask to the clergy saying, you know, we want your advice, we want you to help advertise this, but we're going to do the work if you'll help us figure out how to do it effectively. Because I have spoken to a number of priests who've told me they just, you know, they didn't feel like they had the bandwidth to learn a new topic. And I think that actually one of the common misconceptions clergy sometimes have is they think they have to learn the climate science in order to be able to address this topic. And they don't. What they have to say is, as people of faith, we care, right? The theology they already know. So yes, that is an issue. And in fact, the St. Thomas Aquinas parish out in California, it was one of their frustrations that their pastor never came to one of their meetings, never preached on creation care or climate change or any of those topics. And yet they were able, by working with facilities and grounds, to reduce energy use in their parish by about 25%. So even if the pastors are just sort of passively supportive, there's still a lot that can be accomplished if you have permission to work with facilities, change to LED light bulbs, put in programmable thermostats, convince everybody not to hold the doors open on Sunday morning while people are going in and out of the church building, things like that. But yeah, the old buildings and the lack of financial resources, this is a tremendous challenge. We're not eligible for a lot of the rebates as nonprofits. And this is sort of state by state. Oftentimes there will be grants available, which can be helpful. Here in Michigan, our utility companies will come and do a base level energy audit for free and provide some LED bulbs to replace fluorescent bulbs, things like that, which is a start. But a lot of the time it's, you know, what we've found is it's finding those just retired, energetic, really talented people who can figure out how to do storm window inserts and drywall and things like this, or insulation to improve the buildings, because it is a challenge, those old buildings.
And Tony, do you have a comment, or Lynn, to add on?
I actually I have some really cheap options here. There's a website called PA Power Switch, or there's other ways you can do this, but you could essentially choose what energy provider your building accepts or pays to, and essentially it costs you pretty much nothing. I switched my house, and my electricity rate went from like 5.9 cents to 6.1 cents or something like that, right? It was a super minimal increase, but all of my electricity in my house that isn't powered by the panels is powered by wind, right? And so that's a super easy way. And there's even some scenarios, depending on what you're paying for electricity, it could actually come out to be cheaper. So you could save your parish a little bit of money and not have to do anything. There's also Catholic Ministries is a great example of, they do power purchase agreements. Essentially, they will install a solar array on your roof, and you basically pay them for the electricity. And a lot of times that's even cheaper than your electricity rate. And essentially they purchase the solar array and install it. And then, you know, recycling obviously is a pretty cheap one, right? Making it more accessible for people and that kind of thing. And then finally, I think getting into people's awareness and consciousness through bulletin posts or otherwise is a pretty cheap way to drum up some interest, hopefully with the pastor as well.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add is sometimes a way to finance some of this is through kind of broker groups that do tax credit financing. So different companies will, you know, it's basically you pay for your electricity, but these companies get a tax credit for actually putting in the solar panels or whatever. And so it's just a different way of financing the project, but there are a number of those groups out there.
Thank you, Lynn, and also Tony for that helpful information. I want to point people to the chat that Janine Zappa, Tony, Marge have offered just a wealth of information, nuanced information around this topic of this question. And so I want to encourage people to check that out. We're just about out of time. And so I want to give Dr. Shattuck a minute to give a wrap up, but I wondered if Joyce or Michael, if you have a quick question that we can address briefly here before we move to wrap up.
Yes. I wanted to raise the question of advocacy. It hasn't been raised very much in this discussion. I mean, advocacy with our government at different levels, at the local, at the state, and so on, to adopt a more eco-friendly approach and to subsidize our installation of solar panels and other environmental friendly things. I think this is very important. I put in solar panels about 12 or 15 years ago, and there was a big subsidy from the state, which is state of Pennsylvania, which no longer exists, I believe. And this is a big disincentive for people to go the solar way. So we are the only house here, sadly, and it is not a boast, very, very sadly, in Gilmore Acres in Wilkins Township, which has installed solar panels, and that's pathetic. But I think it's largely driven by our governing people are against solar, and we have really to be advocates to get them to be more on our side, as well as the practical things that we do ourselves.
Thank you, Michael, for that comment and sort of a brief question. I wonder if our speakers have very, very brief remarks on that theme, if they have any words of wisdom to drop into the ears of our audience here before we conclude.
I'm told that when you reach out to legislators and you say you represent a faith community, they let you come in and talk to them. If you say you're from the Sierra Club, they don't. So it's a powerful voice, the voice of the faith community that needs to be elevated in seeking these changes in the way our officials are doing things.
I agree, Sibel. And I think the other reality is, appearing at your borough council meeting, we go regularly, depending on what it is, the Shell cracker plant or, even what's happening in our local boroughs. But I agree, Sibel, they will listen to you. The other reality is, you look at coal being subsidized for how many decades already, because it was a new and burgeoning economic market. And that's exactly what solar and wind power is. And yet we don't do the same thing. So we just need to keep talking about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. Any final remarks, Tony, before we give Dr. Shattuck the final word?
Yeah, I guess maybe this is a bit global, but the amount of subsidies that fossil fuel companies still receive is still astronomical. And in many cases, in many countries, it's more than the solar and all renewable incentives combined, which is a sad state of affair, especially considering, up until recently, a lot of these fossil fuel companies, Exxon, Shell, were, top profitable companies every year after year. And somehow our tax dollars were making their way funneled into that, right? So not to mention, as I mentioned earlier, there's some really severe issues with emissions, right? And I mean, direct health impacts that occur. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not much on advocacy personally. I'm kind of more on the education side. And but I love the idea of getting to talk to a politician based on the having that sort of religious backing. that they can't really deny. I like that idea.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, and before we go to Dr. Shattuck, one quick comment from Jim, my co-facilitator. Please go for it.
There's one question that's really to the group, and it's, can we find a way for local parish creation care groups to connect with each other? If you want to do that, email APP and we'll complete the circle.
Thank you, Jim. Can you drop that email address into the chat? And while he's doing that, Dr. Shattuck, please give us a 1 minute wrap up, and then we'll move into final comments. Thank you.
I've so enjoyed hearing the stories from Sister Lynn and from Tony, and I hope very much to someday visit the Sisters of St. Joseph and see the work that Sister Lynn and her community are doing. And it's just been a delight to see so many people here engaged with this topic. That we're a community that's growing, and yes, we're still, our government's still subsidizing the wrong people, but as more and more people like you step forward and show you're willing to make the effort on your side, you want them now to make the effort on their side. I think we're really close to turning, I hope we're really close to turning a corner. Motivated by love, sustained by faith. We're gonna make it, right? Thank you so much for allowing me to come and speak to you tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shattuck. Everybody, please give Dr. Shattuck a round of applause.